Excited to hear more about our California markets. My name is Jessica. I'm your Director of Communications for the National Biodiesel Board. And I just wanted to just real quickly remind everyone to check in to the session on our conference mobile site, connectbiodieselconference.org. You can do that with your laptop or your mobile device. I think that's a fancy word for your phone. But at the end of the session, we'll draw a name from those of you who have checked in, and we'll announce the winner of an Amazon Smile gift card. And you'll remember from this morning's session that you can go on Amazon Smile, and by purchasing everyday items, you can actually donate to the Biodiesel Foundation. And you do have to be present to win. We'll make the drawing at the end of the session, so that's great incentive to stay and listen to the Q&A afterwards. And if you need any help with the MBB Connect, folks at the back of the room and MBB staff, conference staff, are happy to help you. It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Case. Jennifer is the founder and president of New Leaf Biodiesel, and she's also a member of the National Biodiesel Board Governing Board. Jennifer?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Jessica. My name is Jennifer Case. As she said, I'm the founder and president of New Leaf Biofuel, a biodiesel refinery that's about a 5-minute drive down south from here. I'm also the chair of the California Biodiesel Alliance, which is California's industry trade association, and I am on the National Biodiesel Board Governing Board. My distinguished panelists and I are going to be discussing today the complicated and exciting policies in California that affect biodiesel and the other low-carbon fuels. But before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to take a quick poll. Is there anyone in the room who attended the NBB conference the first time it was in San Diego? Quite a few of you. Okay, so those of you would remember it was 2006. Willie Nelson won the Eye on Biodiesel Award. Luke Perry was on a discussion panel. Remember Luke Perry, 90210? Daryl Hannah literally drank biodiesel, which I don't recommend, by the way. And in March of that year, my friends and I formed New Leaf Biofuel. Sorry about that. And a little over 2 million gallons of biodiesel was consumed in California that year. Fast forward to 2017, 11 conferences later, and California is the fastest growing market for biodiesel in the country. An estimated 360 million gallons of bio and renewable diesel were consumed in 2016, up over 20% from last year, and more than double from 2014. So if you're interested in making money in a growing market, you're definitely in the right room. So my first panelist is Louie Brown. Louie Brown is a partner at Conn, Soares & Conway, LLP. He represents the firm's diverse clients before the California State Legislature and various state administrative agencies. Louie specializes in providing clients with expert advice in maneuvering through California's complex legislative and administrative processes. He has written numerous laws and played key roles in many of the legislature's major accomplishments and budget negotiations over the last decade, including the Agricultural Tax Relief Package, the Water Bond of 2014, and most recently, banning of single-use plastic bags. Louie earned his Bachelor of Science degree from California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo and his Juris Doctor from the McGeorge School of Law, University of the Pacific. Welcome. Try that again.
Okay, we have to go into slideshow mode. There you go.
Oh, there you go. Lesson number 1, we don't ask the political guy to do the IT work. So thanks for your patience, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. As Jennifer said, I am the lobbyist in Sacramento for the biodiesel industry. I've been fortunate enough to work for the California Biodiesel Alliance and the National Biodiesel Board for a number of years now. And Jennifer asked me to kick off this session giving you a little bit on the political landscape dealing with biodiesel in California. Let's just see, first of all, how many in the room are from a state other than California? Excellent. Well, welcome. We like to think of ourselves as an independent country here and do things our own way, as I'm sure any of you who've tried to do business here can attest to. And so I'm the person that tries to deal with the political dynamics that come with biodiesel. And believe me, there are some political dynamics that come with biodiesel in the state legislature, and then interact with Shelby Neal with the National Biodiesel Board on the Air Board piece of it, and Celia DeBose with the California Biodiesel Alliance on the State Water Resources Control Board of it, and there are a whole host of other agencies that we actually deal with as well. So for those of you new to the state of California, let me give you just a little bit of background on what we are doing here. So there was a red wave that came over the country as a result of the 2016 national election. It stopped at the border of California. We are nowhere close to red. We are a deep, deep shade of blue. And we can show that by having a 2/3 supermajority Democratic control here in the state of California. All state offices are held by Democrats, and it'll be that way for the foreseeable future. In fact, if you just look at the voter registration numbers in the state of California, by the time we get to the next census of 2020, it is likely that the Republican Party in the state will fall behind declined-to-state voters when it comes to voter registration. And so the Democratic registration continues to grow, declined-to-state registration continues to grow. Republicans are either static or declining. The priorities for the legislature this year, as they've put out, is affordable housing. Why is my screen changing and yours isn't? There we go. There we go. Here we go. As I was saying, the legislative priorities for the 2017-2018 legislative session: affordable housing, transportation infrastructure, and then fighting anything that the Trump administration attempts to move forward. In fact, if you've recently read our state legislature, the Assembly Speaker, who is in charge of the State Assembly, the lower house, and the President Pro Tem, who's in charge of the upper house in the state legislature, recently put on retainer a former Attorney General Eric Holder for the purposes of defending the principles of the state of California against the Trump administration. And so that will definitely be top of mind in just about anything they do. We do have an adult in the room. His name is Governor Jerry Brown. Now, some of you may remember Governor Jerry Brown in his first iteration 30 years ago. Yes, that is Governor Moonbeam. But in his second iteration, we all deem him to be the adult in the room. And at times is fighting against the Democratic legislature. He's now, believe it or not, in the final years of his administration. He will be the first and only governor of the state of California to serve 4 terms over a 40-year span. He just released a budget, his budget, last week. Every January 10, by the Constitution, the governor has a responsibility of releasing the budget. He is one of the most fiscally conservative Democrats in the state of California, and is actually one of the things that he fears the most is leaving the office and leaving the state of California in a recession. And his numbers, as he projected last week, he believes without some cuts and some different actions taken by the legislature, that by as early as next year, we could see the state of California back into a budget deficit of as much as $2 billion, which is really not much compared to when he first entered the office 7 years ago when facing a $26 billion annual deficit. So he's very conservative. The legislature disagrees with him, as you might expect. They believe revenues will be much higher, and they don't necessarily believe that we need to put as much in the rainy day fund and set aside as he believes. His priorities slightly different than the legislature. He's in his last 2 years. While I think he would argue against it, I think most would say he's in the part of his career where he wants to leave a legacy. And so part of that legacy is the California water fix. Those of you new to the state should know that we have been in a drought for the last 6 years. And notwithstanding the recent rains that we've had in Northern California, 60% of the state is still considered to be in an extreme drought. The governor has a proposal that he wants to move forward with to fix that, called the California Water Fix. He also wants to look at transportation infrastructure. He wants to spend $4 billion on transportation infrastructure. The legislature wants to spend $7 billion. So there will be a difference of opinion as they go there. And then, of course, he has made climate change one of his principles in the last couple years of his administration. So take a look at our budget, and just so you see here, the annual budget, or the budget for California this next fiscal year, is $179 billion. The governor likes to let everyone know that it is the 6th largest economy in the world, and you can see where a majority of that money goes to. Most of the money in the state budget goes to health and human services, as people would expect, and then education. And then if you look at 1.6%, that goes to environmental protection. That's where we do most of our business within the Air Resources Board, the State Water Resources Control Board, and others. And as I said, that without corrective actions, the governor is predicting a $2 billion deficit. So the big issue that we've been dealing with the last couple years in the Capitol has been the reissuance or the passage of SB 32. AB 32 was the landmark bill signed by Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger that created the greenhouse gas reductions in California, which helped drive the creation of the low carbon fuel standard and which created the cap and trade auctions that California is so well known for. Last year, the legislature passed an extension of AB 32. They were very creative and they called it SB 32. They just started it in a different house, but that bill passed. It passed and it extended the deadline and the opportunity and authority for the Air Resources Board to continue reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California and lowered the target line. What it didn't include was an extension of the cap and trade auctions. Since the AB 32 was originally passed, the voters in California passed a voter initiative that redefined what a tax is by the Constitution. And so since that time, the cap and trade auction, which was originally passed as a fee program under the original law, has now changed, and most experts would agree that cap and trade is now a tax. A tax in California requires a 2/3 vote. And notwithstanding the fact that the Democrats own 2/3 majority in both houses, it's just not that easy to get them all to agree on something, especially something as large as a cap and trade extension. And so since cap and trade was created, those auctions have generated, and the legislature and the governor have come together to appropriate more than $3.4 billion on a variety of projects. The governor's projects have been highlighted with high-speed rail, inner-city transportation infrastructure, some affordable housing. The legislature has gotten involved and spent a considerable amount of money on zero-emission vehicles and other light transportation issues within ARB, composting industry, you name it. There's been plenty of people at the trough when it comes to cap and trade auctions. And a majority of those funds have been focused in disadvantaged communities. Now, early on, those auctions were pretty healthy and created a lot of energy and excitement. Early auction proceeds were over $500 million at almost each auction. And then May 2016 came and struck everyone. The auction generated just over $10 million. This was quite a surprise to a legislature that has been spending this money on a very regular basis and was excited to do so. The August 16 auction was even lower, $8 million. And then there was a bump in November 2016, getting us back to some level of normalcy, $360-some million. Some believe that that's because the passage of SB 32 started to create a little bit more stability in people's minds. But without further action by the legislature, cap and trade officially goes away in 2020. So the governor, in his expenditure plan, has put forth and said that he wants to spend, and he's proposing to the legislature to spend $2 billion in cap and trade revenues. Now, of course, this is him believing that those auction proceeds are going to come back and be as healthy as they once were. He has $900 million set aside for the projects that he and the legislature had agreed upon that should be funded on a regular basis: high-speed rail, transit, and affordable housing. And then he, much to our pleasure, put in this $363 million expenditure for 50% reduction in petroleum use. And that's where we've been doing our work over the past few years, making some noise about getting funding for biodiesel investments in the state of California. But there's a catch. The catch from the governor is saying, in order for you to get this $2 billion to spend, you need to pass an extension to cap and trade. And so he wants them to come up with that two-thirds vote in order to make that happen. So as I said, over the past couple years, we've been working on your behalf with a coalition which we've called the Biofuels Coalition in an effort to get some attention and get some funding happening for the biodiesel industry. Last year, the administration heard that message and put $40 million into their budget at the Air Resources Board for that, and another $25 million at the California Energy Commission, specifically for the purposes of promoting biodiesel. It didn't make it into the final budget when the agreement was made, but it showed progress because those numbers were zero in the years previous to that. This year, this coalition is coming back and asking for $100 million of this money going forward to look at infrastructure development, in-state biofuels production incentives, and other areas to improve the environment for biodiesel. There's also other pieces of legislation that we've worked on in the past and that we'll continue to work on. AB 692 was a bill, a well-intentioned bill that we supported vigorously, that said that the state fleet would move towards utilizing more biofuels throughout the fleet. Unfortunately, the Department of General Services interpreted that law to be very narrow in its implementation, forcing us now to go back into the legislature this year to clarify that and to make room for the biodiesel industry. Taxes. Our tax law, just like federal tax law, was written years ago and is very complicated. Well, it was written before we had a biodiesel industry, so things like blending biodiesel aren't well taken care of in the tax code. Dyed biodiesel with dyed diesel fuel, not well taken care of in the tax code. So we have to go to the legislature and clarify some of these issues. AB1, SB1, that's the legislature's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure measures, and the way they want to fund that measure is primarily through increased fuel taxes. We're working with the authors of those bills to try to get biofuels out of those increases so that we create a more stable market. And what will the future of legislation be? Really hard to tell. On average, there are 2,500 bills introduced every year in the California legislature. And that deadline doesn't happen until February 20th, so we have plenty of time for new and good ideas to be introduced by 120 legislators. Regulation. Well, regulation, you can't have that. You can't do business in California without regulation, unfortunately. This is just a brief synopsis of all the different agencies that we deal with on your behalf. And I'm sure that I've probably left off a couple more. But I want to definitely give a shout out to Shelby Neal with National Biodiesel Board, because of the time that he's spending in California on all of your behalf, bringing the technical expertise in dealing with the Air Board on the LCFS, the low emission diesel regulation, and then dealing with other issues that we have to deal with in California. NOx issues, for example, in the San Joaquin Valley and the greater Los Angeles Basin. There's a State Water Resources Control Board. Celia DuBose has spent a lot of time with them on underground storage tanks, again, to show a conflict in laws. We have the Air Resources Board promoting biodiesel with low carbon fuel standards and other rules, only to have the State Water Resources Control Board say, that's great, but you can't store it underground. So we've been working with the State Water Resources Control Board to clarify those rules and slowly making that progress so that we can get, hopefully very soon, get to there's a blanket accreditation for up to B20 blends. California Energy Commission, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, I can keep adding here the Board of Equalization, the Franchise Tax Board, you name it, the number of different agencies involved in your business that we're working with on a daily basis to try to improve the business environment here in California. And Jennifer is telling me that my time has come, so I will now pass it on to Ryan.
Thanks, Louie. There's a lot of information there, and there's going to be some time at the end for some questions. So Ryan Lamberg, our next panelist, serves as the Executive Director of the California Biodiesel Initiative, an environmental partnership of the National Biodiesel Board and the California Biodiesel Alliance. As a technical consultant, Lamberg is instrumental to the NBB's Pacific Coast effort to promote biodiesel's environmental benefits and boost production and consumption of biodiesel across the United States. Lamberg co-founded and served as Communications and Logistics Director for Community Fuels, now one of California's largest biodiesel production facilities. While at Community, he helped found the CBA, a regional network to help biodiesel producers advance their legislative and political goals. Ryan?
Great, thank you. And Louie, thank you for your presentation. I would have to say that if you came in late, it's not going to make sense. Because Louie really sets it up as what's really going on in California. My focus today is to discuss kind of a deeper dive on the low carbon fuel standard. So what Louie did a great job of setting the overall parameters and the political view. I'll be looking a little bit more just at one specific regulation and how that is helping us to meet what Louie talked about, which was that AB 32 and now SB 32 goals in the context of the low carbon fuel standard. So just again, big picture, what happened in 2016 and where are we going towards 2019? So again, Louie mentioned the SB 32, the 40% reduction targets now set out from 2020 now to 2030. That gives us a new benchmark to work towards, so that we're gonna see a whole slew of new laws as well as regulations that support these new goals. The implementation of new rules that were adopted in 2015 took effect, so we now had different ILUC numbers and pathway numbers that are now implemented into the new rule, which is now in effect as of 2016, phasing out of old numbers and phasing in new CIs. Now there's much discussion going on the scoping plan. So again, this is a big piece in the regulatory side, and CARB is considering what are those 2030 goals under SB 32. So right now we're at a 10% reduction of carbon intensity by 2020. To get there, we've changed our slope. We've now moved from what we were stalled at 1% for several years because of some hurdles that we had to get through as a state. We're now, starting January, at a 3.5% reduction, moving towards 10% very quickly. But what's going to happen towards 2030? And that's where ARB is now considering new targets. Introducing a verification process and ideally moving that to protocols. Probably they're targeting by 2019. So again, a verification, much like a QAP type thing on the federal level, but for California and the LCFS. And we've seen a whole lot of credit and volume growth as those reductions have increased. So equivalency of about 2,000 gas gallon equivalents. This is in millions, and then 100 million metric ton reduction of carbon. We're currently banking about 8.2 million metric tons. That's above where we need to be in the low carbon fuel standard. So that's terrific, but we're going to have a lot more creation to get to that 10% and beyond. So also, we're opening discussions in 2017 towards the finalization of 2018 and to implement any changes in LCFS by 2019. So what does it look like in the low carbon fuel standard? I think interestingly, you'll see that about 80% of the fuels to date in the last year for low carbon fuel standard have been generated by liquid biofuels. Between renewable diesel, biodiesel, and ethanol, that's 80% of the pie. So that's great, but as we'll see, we have some other additional pieces that are growing quickly, but at smaller scale. So what are these numbers that we're talking about? In California alone, we're using, and again, instead of getting into the details of the numbers, about 3 billion gallons of diesel fuel a year. How much biodiesel are we consuming? Well, in the fiscal year 2014 to 15, about 80 million gallons consumed. And in the last fiscal year, about 140 million gallons. So if you look at that, what is that on a state average? We're consuming about what was about 3% or a B3, moving up to a B5 just in the last fiscal year. The numbers there on the third column represent the additionality of renewable diesel. And what are the types of prices that we're seeing for this? So this is just in the last week. We're seeing about $90 per ton for the average price, and volumes increasing again. Biodiesel's so does everyone understand the idea that in the renewable fuel, so under RFS, it's volumetric. And obviously under LCFS, you've got something that's based on a market-based approach to lower carbon intensity. And that's really what is the driver. And we'll discuss more of that as we move through the presentations. But you can see that biodiesel's carbon intensity has been going down over time, which is fantastic and really helps to meet the obligations of the obligated parties. These numbers I pulled together from CARB data as well, showing the growth of the biodiesel industry year over year since 2011. And while it seems like it's slowing down, I think we're ready to see an additional large growth over the next several years. So what do these numbers mean to you? If you're not from California, if you're a biodiesel producer in the Midwest, on the low range, we're talking about an average this last year of about $100 a ton. So if you've got a CI of about a 30, that means 77 cents per gallon. And if you've got a CI of about a 50, that's about 54 cents per gallon. So as a transfer of money to the biodiesel industry, we're talking about $120 to $170 million transfer over this per year, that is per year, in this time frame of 2017 to 2023. And the reason I put those numbers is because we'll talk a little bit more about the ADF, or the alternative diesel fuel regulation, but it may limit the statewide average. It's possible it may limit the statewide average, hopefully it won't, to about 7.5% over this time frame. And on the low range for after this time frame, up to 2031, you could see the market growing to a B20, or close to a B20, and a transfer of essentially $315 to $450 million. That's on the low range. On the higher range, and with the hope that we have a strong mitigation process in place, and again, without raising too many hopes to do that, but with that hope, we could go to that B20 quicker and be there by the beginning of this ADF process and move into a much greater transfer to biodiesel producers over that time. And on the higher range, seeing that closer to 875 million gallon market and a transfer of about $700 million per year. So what are some of the developing themes in California? Again, Louie touched on them. There's a high focus on EVs, and really, we still have some of the worst air quality in the nation. We do have the worst air quality in the nation in certain basins. So there's still a strong focus on smog and improving air quality, and therefore reduction of NOx. Transportation is now our largest source of GHGs, and we're trying to reduce GHGs by 40% by 2030. I've talked about that, but also 80% of NOx and 95% of PM. Talked a lot about SB 32. Additional things that we're moving towards, I've touched on some of these issues with the scoping plan, and Louie talked about cap and trade. We're also looking to protect the low carbon fuel standard and make sure that people are aware of it. People generally, it's really has not been high on people's radars outside of alternative fuels, outside this room. People really have not heard of the low carbon fuel standard. So how do we protect it? Additional rules in California, I'll stop on this point here. This 50% lower NOx alternative diesel, CARB is considering going beyond that petroleum reduction of simply, what they'd like to do is reduce diesel fuel and replace 50% of the diesel fuel with alternative biofuel. And to do that, biodiesel could play a huge role. So that could be really exciting. That process is just starting, and conversations around that is just starting. The power structure, as Louie said, is also changing quickly and focused on environmental justice communities. Also, verification process is starting and moving forward. So where do we go from here? Perhaps 18 to 25% by 2030. And I listed out some of the percentage growth. We're going to see huge growth over the next few years in California, 3.5% in 2017, 5% in 2018, 7.5% in 2019, and 10% in 2020. These are the reductions towards our goal. So these are significant jumps in terms of volumes and CI reduction. Greater focus on petroleum reduction and on our NOx mitigation additive. So again, without being a chemist, but hearing very positive comments about how we might get to that NOx mitigation strategy, with that, hopefully we'll get there. We're constantly working in unison with other alternative fuels and other folks that are interested in supporting this process, and teaming up against the threat of palm and rainforest destruction is very important. We're always funding studies, and again, with the support of people in this room, funding the types of studies that look to third-party science to verify the type of important work that we're doing to express that to CARB in a way that they can understand the data. Writing letters, partnering with coalitions and campaigns, always the wallpaper of meetings. looking at verification and moving towards promoting domestic production. These are some of the scenarios that the LCFS, these are direct from CARB in terms of previous scenarios, and then looking towards biomass-based diesel volume numbers. We're talking about 1.2 billion gallons in California by 2024. These are not small numbers. 1.6 billion gallons by 2030. And again, the context of understanding the West Coast mentality, we're still in this drought period, and Jerry Brown is leading us towards that future of strong climate protectionism. Again, EVs and in environmental justice communities that drive a lot of the conversation in Sacramento. Again, Louie talked about a whole fleet of different regulatory and legislative tracks. The reason this is so small and you can't really read it is because there are so many different tracks going on throughout California and so many things to follow, and it's important that we weigh in on all these regulatory bodies, legislative bodies, to make sure that they get the message about biodiesel and how it can help us get to our goals. These goals that California is setting out, again, is this 80% reduction of NOx by 2031. So how are we going to get there? If we can't get there with vehicles, we're going to have to get there through the fuel. Biodiesel, you've probably seen a slide much like this with all the different benefits that it has on air quality. And we're often educating folks not only about the greenhouse gas reduction, up to 86% per gallon of greenhouse gas reduction, but the whole plethora of different benefits of air quality benefits that we see from biodiesel. NOx is that one that hopefully will also be coming down in the next several years. We're working constantly to support the LCFS across all the alternative fuels, and we've built these talking points across our platform to make sure that we're consistent in our messaging, that cap and trade alone is not enough, that we need to work in tandem. It can't just be one program. It has to be all to get us to our goals, that it's delivering clean alternative fuel choices, and that it's helped to avoid 1.6 billion in health-related impacts from air pollution thus far. It's achievable and feasible. It's sound. It's purposely designed with a safety valve that limits compliance costs to $200 a ton, crafting tremendous market pull and widespread support from business. So with that, I think I'm on time.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian.
How many times did I mention your name? Like 10?
All right, so our next speaker is Cynthia Obadia. Cynthia is an experienced energy trading professional who works as a consultant for biofuel producers in maximizing the financial incentives from California's carbon regulations, as well as EPA's renewable fuel standard. Also, Argus Media is one of her clients, supporting their business development in the West Coast. Prior to consulting, she worked in the energy trading desks at Shell, Goldman Sachs, and Petróleos de Venezuela. Did I get that? Yeah. All right. I'm going to try to load your presentation.
That's it, okay. Hello, good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you about the other fuels, and I'm going to end with just a quick comment, a quick picture at what's gone on in the wild ride in the LCFS markets in the last year. So let's start with Do I just do this? The arrow? Okay, very good. Arrow, okay. No, see. Oh, I know. I have to do the thing.
Screen, but it didn't seem to work. I pressed that.
I got it, okay.
This mouse. He's gonna probably shut it.
Why do we just? There we go. Is that it? No.
Where are we? Right here.
He's closing a lot of the files, getting us organized. Yes.
There we go.
Very good. And just arrow down, right? Yeah, okay. So let's start by, the first thing I want to give you an overall picture of what's going on in California versus the federal market. Here on the left, you will see a pie chart of the fuels Ryan already showed on the LCFS on the right, but of the RFS program. And as you can see, pretty much ethanol and biodiesel are the most important, largest fuels. And only 1 little percent of, you'll see CNG and LNG playing a role there in, decimals of a percent of any other fuels. On the LCFS, like Ryan mentioned, it's all driven by the CI index, and therefore we have a much more diversified biofuel based. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on basically CNG, LNG, and a little bit about electricity, as they're growing significantly, and as you will see. So what is the CI index of all the different fuels? This chart is in the CARB website. And I really like this chart because it shows you where the X is the average carbon intensity of the different fuels. So for example, hydrogen has a carbon intensity of 0. It's a very, very attractive fuel. Ethanol, on the other hand, here we have the average ethanol, although there are some ethanols that are low carbon intensity. As you can see, the blue bubbles, the average carbon intensity is around 80. And then so going down, you can see that, for example, bio-LNG, that's LNG from renewable natural gas, or biogas, as sometimes it's called, is about 30. And above that one in the orange is electricity, about 30. That's the carbon intensity. So you can see the lower fuels are increasing in volume. And that's the whole purpose of the program. So let's talk a little bit about renewable natural gas. Here we have a chart of diesel gallon equivalents by quarter that are consumed in California. The green line shows you the amount of LCFS credits that have been produced through CNG and LNG. And as you can see, since 2011, it's grown quarter by quarter, but in the last few quarters, it's been pretty much stagnant growth. And the reason for the stagnant growth is due to the low price of diesel as an alternative fuel, and therefore not encouraging the conversion in that direction. But what I wanted to show, what I think is really interesting about this chart is the fact that the CNG and LNG are increasingly being fueled by renewable natural gas. That's the blue column versus the red column is natural gas. So notice how renewable natural gas has increased in its volume in basically being the fuel of choice of CNG and LNG, should we call them dispensers. Why is renewable natural gas growing so much? First of all, natural gas doesn't qualify for RINs, so renewable natural gas gets RINs and LCFS credits. The carbon intensity of natural gas is not as low. Going on the RNG side of the slide, They qualify for cellulosic RINs, which are very, very expensive. The pricing of cellulosic RINs relies on what's called the cellulosic waiver credit, which is, has an inverse relationship to the price of gasoline. So as gasoline goes down, basically D3 or cellulosic RINs go up, and that's really helped the pricing of renewable natural gas. And that started only in August of 2014. Before that, it only qualified for advanced RINs, which are a lot lower priced. That's only for landfills, though. Landfills qualify for D3s, whereas digesters, whether it's, they can qualify for D3s or D5s, depending whether their feedstock is cellulosic or not. Anyways, the low carbon, they have a low carbon intensity, and they get a lot of financing in California if they're based in California, like biodiesel, also producers in California. They're available for grants. This chart shows you the immense growth in price, rise in price of 1 MMBTU of renewable natural gas as compared to natural gas. Natural gas by itself is just the blue portion of this chart. The green portion is the LCFS credit, and then the orange portion is the RIN. So you can see that per MMBTU, basically the price has almost tripled since 2014. And that has encouraged a lot its use in CNG and LNG. So where's the RNG coming from? It's all coming to California. All the RNG that's available pretty much federally, it's all coming to California. 76% are from landfills, and all the landfills are located outside of California because, funny enough, California landfills are not allowed to inject biogas into the pipelines in California. But biogas from other landfills outside of the state, they can come in, but they can't be from California landfills. So that's interesting. It's an old rule that they're trying to change. The RNG Coalition is trying to change that. 63% only of all the RNG that's produced in the United States is going to transportation. The rest is still going to electricity. So slowly but surely, because biogas also qualifies for the RPS program in California. So as those contracts end, then they'll go to the transportation sector. There's only 2 digesters in California that actually produce biogas for transportation. What is the future of biogas? There's 24 projects under construction. So basically, 54 existing projects and 24 under construction. And the reason is that price chart you saw. Very, very aggressive and attractive pricing for development. So now let's talk about what's the future outlook for CNG and LNG. Biogas production is all well and good, but you need the growth of CNG and LNG. You need the conversion of the fleets to go from diesel to CNG and LNG. Well, it ain't happening right now because of low diesel prices. So that's why you see that stagnant growth in LNG and CNG. There may be some growth in 2018 from the low NOx natural gas combustion engine, coupled with RNG. It's a very, attractive choice for new trucks because it meets 3 of California's environmental goals: 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050, the achievement of the national ambient air quality standards like Louie described, and reduction of emissions in the most impacted and disadvantaged communities. So there may be some growth on LNG and CNG on that in the future. Now let's talk a little bit about electricity. It's also grown a lot, but it was a tiny, 3% in California the second quarter of last year. So growth is, easy in a way. What is interesting about electricity is that during 2016, we saw for the first time utilities selling LCFS credits that they produced from vehicle charging. That was the first time we saw PG&E comes out and sells LCFS credits. SMUD sold LCFS credits. BART sold LCFS credits. That is all brand new in 2016. So we're starting to see activity in terms of LCFS credits generated from electricity. Also some transit agencies in different cities across California. The governor's goal has the ZEV mandate, and he is intent on having 1.5 million cars on the road, electric vehicles, by 2025. However, a recent study by the NRDC found that that's not going to happen. And the reason is that the incentive program that drives electrical car, price, rebates, those kind of incentive programs, they're not working right now, and that whole structure needs to be modified to promote more sale of electric cars. So that's a challenge. As a matter of fact, I just read today that only 1 million electric vehicles are expected to be sold through 2025, so quite short of the governor's goal. Another thing that's very hotly, debated is that CARB has mandated that all transit agencies in California switch to electric buses by 2020. And they're saying, whoa, wait a minute. I've already switched to CNG and LNG, and that has a lower carbon intensity. Why do I have to buy a whole fleet of new buses? And they're fighting it with tooth and nail. I mean, and it's, as a California taxpayer, I'm on board with that one. So in summary, about the other fuels, while electric vehicles will probably see the largest growth on a percentage basis, it's still very small. CNG and LNG growth is not expected that fast, but expect RNG, renewable natural gas, to fill 100% of it, for sure. And hydrogen is another technology, but still very, very small and needs tons of infrastructure and investment. So, diesel, you're still there. All good. So now just a peek of the roller coaster of the LCFS markets in the last year. Just to give you like a little bit of a look at this chart. I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. And it has a lot to do with what Louie and Ryan spoke before in terms of all the regulations, all the fighting that goes on the Capitol there in Sacramento. So let me just start. I'll just tell you this quick story of this chart. Basically, the price of LCFS was really boring, $25 a ton since basically April of 2014. And in June of 2015, CARB announced the draft regulations for the readoption of the program. And then everybody was like, okay, now we have the compliance curves. We know what we have to do. We're not going to have that many LCFS credits. Let's start buying. And the market basically grew by 5 times from June of 2015 to December of 2015. It was crazy. It was nuts. The market was so bullish and confident that during January there was calls being offered, call options being offered at $200. That's a soft cap of the program. The LCFS program has a soft cap. Says, we don't want the oil companies to have to pay that much for it. $200. That's about right. That's the maximum. Anyways, so it was very bullish. And then around April, a case that had been filed since 2014, the California Chamber of Commerce versus CARB, relating to the auctions that Louie mentioned, whether it's a tax or it's not a tax, and et cetera, all of a sudden it revived. The appellate court sent 7 questions to all the participants in the case, and everybody's like, where did that come from? And that put a question mark, lack of confidence into the program. And you can see how the market started to weaken. To add insult to injury, as Louie mentioned, the negotiations for SB 32 started getting really dirty about the governor really wanted the 2/3 majority to adopt SB 32 because then it would have quieted down this suit. And he said, I want the 2/3 majority. What do we have to do? And the oil company said, oh, you want the vote of these conservative Democrats? Well, you're going to have to either eliminate LCFS or you're going to have to modify it. Everybody's like, whoa, sell. The market started selling. You can see the market falling, and it reached $55 a ton by pretty much by August. It was a disaster. A lot of the biodiesel producers, everybody who held credits were very, very concerned about that. Then, of course, it was like, no, it's safe, LCFS. The governor was like, yeah, LCFS. So then market goes up again. So anyways, we're there. We're up, very close to 100. It settled at 98.50 on Friday. And it's, as you can see, I did want to highlight the little dips in the market when PG&E, they're a regulated utility. They've got a lot of credits. They got to go out and sell them. Well, they sell huge chunks, like 60,000 tons at a time, and so they cause a little bit of a stir in the market. But it's not a lot in terms of the overall number of credits out there, but the fact that they go out and sell them like that, it's quite, kind of gets people's attention. So anyways, that's the story of the LCFS market. So what are the things to watch if you want to follow the LCFS market? The pending lawsuits, definitely, got to keep an eye on those. The increased CI reduction on the curves, because now that SB 32 has been adopted, 40% reduction by 2030, well, those CI curves, the compliance curves are going to be reduced. So that's going to cause more demand for LCFS credits, for sure. On the supply side, you've got these sales by the utilities that go out and sell and, scare the market a little bit. You've got more sophisticated trading instruments. For example, there are collars being discussed, collars on LCFS credits. I mean, that's, now the more sophisticated traders are getting into the market because there's more confidence in the market. And then, of course, I wanted to mention limitations on biodiesel blending imposed by the ADF regulation that Ryan mentioned earlier. So that's my little story on the craziness of the market that we've all lived through last year. And thank God, now hopefully this year we won't have to. All right, thank you very much.
Presentation here. Thanks, Cynthia. No one would ever accuse California of being boring when it comes to LCFS credits.
I think there's a place on the ARB website she just put in the lines that we talked about. The timing, That's so helpful in showing us.
Okay, our next speaker is Greg Staiti. He's an attorney that has more than 15 years of experience working with petroleum and renewable fuel companies. He specializes in California Air Resources Board compliance, focusing on California's low carbon fuel standard and other carbon initiatives. In addition, he has experience in assessing liability risks associated with regulatory noncompliance, advising clients on elective disclosure, and negotiating contracts for physical oil and renewable fuel commodities, as well as renewable and alternative fuel credits. Greg's specialized and technical industry knowledge allows him to provide exceptional consulting services to his clients. He earned his Juris Doctor from George Mason University and a bachelor's degree from Tufts University.
No, that's not it. It's down here. Or it's up here. Or we have to tell I got it once.
Not even gonna try. That's me, yeah.
No, but
It's just not up.
That's not it.
It's just not showing. There you go.
It's coming.
All right, and just arrow keys to move it? Yes. There we go. Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I feel a little bit like the cooler coming in at the end of 3 very positive presentations in a row, sort of speaking to boundless opportunity. I'm not here to put too large a damper on expectations or or the incentives that have been discussed here. Rather, just try to hopefully offer some helpful tips for how you can comply with some of the programs that have been discussed here, as well as provide a resource for answering any questions in the time that are remaining. The programs we're going to be talking about, at least in my presentation, focus on the LCFS, but we're also going to talk about California's greenhouse gas reporting requirements, which do apply to y'all in the biodiesel space, depending upon where you're selling in the market, and then touch on the alternative diesel fuel regulation a little bit more and talk about some of the blending limitations that have been alluded to in the earlier presentations. I'll try not to go over too much of what the good ground that was already covered in some of the earlier presentations, and I also know that my PowerPoints can be a bit wordy, so I'll definitely not be reading. What I will say is just in order to kind of level set and kind of talk about some of the basics of this program, let's talk generally first about who it applies to and where the opportunities are. Obviously, we're talking about it in the context of biodiesel, largely here for this audience, but it is a program that applies to and creates obligations for a wide range of transportation fuels. Cynthia touched on some of the other alternative fuels that may provide, or that are providing and may in the future provide a larger piece of the pie of the credit generation that's happening in California. But there are some limitations on the applications to which these fuels can be sold, and that's important to kind of keep aware of, particularly if anyone is looking at renewable diesel opportunities in California, and may also be looking at jet. That's not currently a permissible application, whereas obviously it is under the RFS program. That is probably something that will be addressed in regulatory changes in the next cycle of regulations, but for now, that's something to keep aware of. There are other applications to which this program does not apply, and it's important to keep those aware as you're starting to sell into the market and explore how much share is available for new fuels entering the market. This is a program that shares a lot of similarities to the RFS, which in some respects makes compliance easier. You can think of some common terminology and some common ways of even just thinking about the market incentives. But there are some important differences. The initial regulated party for a given transportation fuel in California is going to be the producer of that transportation fuel, at least for a liquid fuel like biodiesel, is going to be the producer of that fuel in California or the importer into the state. That does not mean that they are the credit generator. Under the LCFS, the opportunity to generate credits is transferable along with all the other compliance obligations for that fuel, save for reporting. The producer and the importer will always have to report. But anyone in the market could become a credit generator so long as they have purchased a qualifying volume of a renewable fuel and they've received the LCFS obligations on that. And what we have seen, the dynamic that seems to have taken hold in this market is that those obligations are being passed, both on fuels that create deficits like gasoline and diesel, and fuels that have the opportunity to generate credits. And that's being passed as far down as the rack, which is the last point where it can be passed to. So that creates obviously a different dynamic in terms of how you're valuing the product and when you might actually be able to receive a marketable credit versus simply a fuel that has the opportunity to generate that credit. As far as evaluating the actual credit generation opportunity, the program is conceptually simple. Many of you may have seen the compliance schedules that CARB has published in the regulations. These are compliance schedules aimed at achieving a goal of a 10% reduction in the transportation fuel carbon intensity for the California transportation fuel pool by 2020. Those annual standards essentially set the metric against which your individual fuel is going to be measured. And the lower the carbon intensity that's established for your fuel, the better your credit generation opportunity. There's a lot more to it than that, but that essentially is how this program works. That differs obviously from a volumetric standard like the RFS, but I think that in some respects, the LCFS works more efficiently in terms of trying to reward those fuels and those feedstocks that provide the best bang for their buck from a greenhouse gas perspective. I won't go over in too much detail the information on this slide. I think it's just important to know that, like any good regulatory program, there are registration requirements, there are reporting requirements. You need to know when your deadlines for reporting those are. It's also important to be aware of the elements that do need to be included on product transfer documents for sellers in this market. There's a lot more to it than what's required for the RFS, and it's important to review the specific requirements of the LCFS, particularly when you're selling a product and retaining those obligations that I mentioned, because that is something that is perfectly permissible under this program. As I mentioned, anyone in the chain until that fuel hits the rack can receive the obligations on that fuel. That also means that anyone can retain those obligations and resell a now non-obligated fuel upstream of the rack. That person now has locked in. They are the credit generator, but that also creates some additional requirements for them when they are issuing their product transfer document to the next party in the chain. And that is critical not only for their compliance, but also for downstream parties' compliance when they're receiving a non-obligated fuel. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. So let's talk about, just to highlight, a few key issues, in particular under the LCFS, where it's easy to kind of trip up on some of the hazards that this program presents from a regulatory perspective. First, as a general concept, what is carbon intensity? It's basically your greenhouse gas footprint. It's an attempt to model based on a data set for an existing producer of at least 2 years. Every aspect of fuel production, of the carbon intensity associated with the feedstocks that they're using, the transportation of those feedstocks, producing fuels, energy consumed, delivery of that fuel to the California market, and ultimately the combustion of that fuel in a vehicle. All of that gets pulled into a very complicated model that my good friend Don O'Connor, who I see walking up the aisle there, is much better able to explain than I. All that gets modeled, and all of that ultimately yields a carbon intensity number that essentially allows the fuel to be evaluated against its peers and against other fuels serving other markets. All of that provides sort of a perfect opportunity for any potential misstep to create a noncompliance. And we're not talking about fraud. We're talking about a perfectly reasonable misallocation of the amount of feedstock that someone might have believed that they used, but they just recorded it wrong, either during the initial modeling period or on an ongoing basis. I can't stress this enough, and this will come up towards the end of my presentation as well when we talk about the verification audit program that CARB is looking at. Understanding the complexities of your fuel producer-specific fuel pathway is critical to maintaining compliance under this program. To date, there haven't been any major enforcement actions by CARB under this program affecting fuel pathway compliance, I think in part because there simply hasn't been an ongoing audit protocol like the one that's being considered. But I can guarantee you that this is something that's going to be squarely in the crosshairs of CARB as they proceed forward with the enforcement of this program, is whether or not a producer has complied with their individual pathway, and even whether or not the fuel received by a downstream party who's receiving the obligations either from that producer or indirectly can be chased back to that producer, whether or not they've got valid credits. You know, in some respects, this program is not that different from RINs in that the person using credits bears ultimate legal responsibility. The ARB will certainly say that they would go after the producer in the first instance if the producer was at fault for causing a noncompliance, if for using an incorrect feedstock or reporting it incorrectly. But there is there's a tail of liability attached to those obligations. It's important to have trust in the producer that is identified in the product transfer documents for that fuel that's being sold to you, that you know that they are complying with their fuel pathway. Inventory management under this program is another challenge. There is a significant balkanization of the fuel market in terms of the CIs that are available for producers. Every fuel producer under the regulations that came into effect as of January 1st this year that wants to sell a renewable fuel in California has to develop their own unique carbon intensity. That means every single fuel product that is being sold into California, while there may be similar ranges or what you might be able to expect, what's actually being reported is going to be a unique fuel pathway that is traceable back to that producer. That means if I'm someone midstream in this market, I could be handling dozens upon dozens of different CIs depending upon how diverse my offerings are. And I need to be able to manage those CIs. And I need to be able to be sure that not only am I receiving the information that I need from my suppliers, but I'm also being able to pass along the correct information to those who are buying from me. And look, if most business at that level is being handled on a flash title basis, then that should be relatively simple. But if you've got any sort of storage play and you're holding on to CIs for a particular period of time, then you have to have a means of tracking that. Further upstream, it's important to be able to track your feedstocks so that you're, as I mentioned earlier, allocating the correct CI in the first place to the fuels that you're producing. Again, I'll hit this point of emphasis again, just make sure it lands home. Complying with your fuel pathway and any of the specifics that, concerning feedstock usage or any other assumptions, you know, the amount of co-products that you're producing on a given batch, the fuel yields for feedstocks, all of that is critically important, and that all plays into how you're tracking your feedstocks too. So this is an issue that producers need to worry about primarily on if they are using a multitude of feedstocks in a given production cycle, and it's something that the downstream buyers of that finished fuel need to be able to manage in terms of the CI that's assigned to their fuel. Got a couple exercises here. We'll move pretty quickly through these just to kind of, you know, break things up. But one question that I've seen come up from time to time is whether or not if I'm selling a renewable fuel into California, if I can claim a carbon intensity for some other renewable fuel that I happen to own contemporaneously. So I've given a 2-rail car example here. And the question is, well, if I've got this really good UCO biodiesel CI, which has a CI of 20, but it doesn't happen to be on a rail car that's heading to California, can I claim that for the same amount of fuel that happens to be on a rail car that's being delivered into California, but also happens to be for a fuel product that has a higher CI? I'd say that the answer there is definitively no. Okay, California does, and CARB staff, and speaking with them, do afford some flexibilities when it comes to managing your CI, but they want the CI for the fuel that's actually arrived in California. Just a little wrinkle on that, though. What if those two fuels get commingled outside California? What then? Do I get some sort of weighted average new CI? I really hope everybody's shaking your heads no. No, because there's no fuel pathway associated with that weighted average new CI. The CI is determined at the point of production, and it's locked in. Now, do you get to volumetrically account for the better CI that's delivered into that tank that also happens to be commingled with the fuel that has a higher CI? I'd say yes. Now, I think that there's different viewpoints, and it depends upon your appetite for risk, on whether or not that accounting method should be on a first-in, first-out basis, or if you feel like you've got the documentation to support saying, well, I know that I've got, 5,000 barrels of the really good CI in that tank, and I'm delivering that amount out now. I can track that. I know it. I feel confident in it. Whether or not I feel confident enough to take that forward and report that to CARB, that's a question for companies to either determine on their own or hopefully to engage a company like mine to ask CARB to figure out for them. Exports, last issue I want to hit on the LCFS here. How am I doing? Okay. Exports, this is an issue that we've seen come up in the RFS context recently, but it's also an important issue in the LCFS space as well. There is no, strictly speaking, export or RVO under the LCFS program, but there is a requirement for parties to report the exports of renewable fuel from California. That's even if they didn't get the obligations on that fuel. So they may not have any credit generation opportunity or offsetting credit opportunity that would be retired out by reporting that export, but nonetheless they are stuck with having to report the export and having an amount of credits automatically deducted from their reporting system, which is called the LRT. I think it's important before exporting to basically assess what your obligations are going to be and to determine what the impact is going to be on your credit balance. Okay, enough of the LCFS. Let's talk about some other stuff. Greenhouse gas reporting. The good news here is that you're only essentially subject to a reporting obligation. The bad news is this is often overlooked. If you are selling a covered transportation fuel, and that includes biodiesels, over the rack in California for delivery to a retailer, or if you're delivering from outside the state and delivering directly to a retailer, that's a reportable fuel. There are certain reporting thresholds that have to be met first, and I won't go through because I can't go through in my head the amounts that are required to equal these carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. But it is important to know that this is a program that needs to be complied with, and depending upon your level of activity, it may also go beyond merely reporting, but actually engaging a third party to come in and verify your reports. That said, this is just going to turn into a reporting obligation, an annual reporting obligation for folks who are selling in those two positions that I just mentioned. This is not, it would take an astronomical sum of product to implicate biodiesel sales in cap and trade because of the exemptions that apply to biogenic carbon dioxide emissions from biodiesel. The alternative diesel fuel program, I want to talk about this briefly. It's been touched on before, but what you need to know now in California is that this is a record-keeping and reporting obligation for producers and for terminal blenders. But starting next year, there are some actual blend restrictions that will apply depending upon the cetane level of the fuel, and also depending upon whether or not it has been treated with an approved additive. Currently, the only approved additive that I'm aware of is, and God, this is where chemistry fails me, dibutyl tertiary peroxide, DBTP. I would recommend looking specifically to the regulations, but I can tell you that essentially the use of that additive starting next year, if blended up to, I believe, a 1% blending level of the overall biodiesel that's being sold, would allow up to 20% a B20 blend. But lacking that or something short of that 1% level, parties may have to accept certain limitations based both on, again, the cetane level and the time of year of the sale of what the permissible amount of biodiesel can be blended into diesel fuel. Lastly, just to touch on what's ahead, and some of this has already been covered, but planning post-20 for the LCFS is in full effect. Certainly under the schedules that have been published through the end of this current iteration of the LCFS, biodiesel in almost any form and feedstock combination looks like it will be a net credit generator, particularly if higher biodiesel blends become the norm. But there is the possibility that as standards become stricter, certain biodiesels may lose out on the opportunity, and it will become more a point of emphasis as to finding the lowest carbon feedstocks to supply that biodiesel that's being delivered into the California market. There's also going to be, as I mentioned before, a greater emphasis on producer compliance in the form of verification audits and a rulemaking that CARB is looking to hopefully finalize this year and give a one-year preparation and planning period next year for, so that they would take effect in 2019. This may end up looking very similar to QAP. We don't know at this point because most of the finer points are still being fleshed out. But there's also a decent chance that ARB draws inspiration from international programs and standards in order to develop a program that harmonizes well with the expansion of the LCFS, because this is certainly something I think, that is a priority for ARB, not only in terms of making a program that will be viable for this state, but a model that can be copied and adopted and essentially provide a broader LCFS market overall for jurisdictions not only outside of California, but outside of the U.S. as a whole. And with that, I'll turn it over for any questions. Thank you.
Thanks to all the panelists and for everyone's patience in our technical difficulties. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I first want to just conclude the panel by saying that I think you guys have probably noticed that it's the California regulatory environment is, while exciting, it's also very complicated. There's a lot of potential for policy failures. We've seen what happened in the federal market with the RIN fraud. We have potential for that. We have threats with ADF. We have threats with lawsuits. Obviously, we're competing with petroleum. So it's complicated, but it's exciting. And I really want to thank my panelists for really showing a broad range of the issues. Go ahead.
Thank you. Doug Hooper, Advanced Biofuels Canada. I've got a couple of questions. I'll just put them both out there and then let you have at them. One is with respect to refineries, and interested in your views as to what strategies at the refineries in terms of renewable hydrogen or biocrude feeds, what influence they will have in an LCFS market in California going forward. And the second question is, in terms of the influences on the range of 18 to 25% as 2030 reduction targets, what you speculate may be the greatest influence on determining that range and pushing it towards the higher end.
So I'll try to answer the first part of the question, which is essentially where are we going, I think, in terms of renewable hydrogen and biocrudes as a refiner compliance strategy. I think overall this is a market that has an appetite for credits any way that they can get them. And I think especially in the out years of this phase, and certainly as we transition to next year, any opportunity to generate credits and or reduce the deficits that are created in the first place for traditional petroleum, I think refiners will seize upon that opportunity, and we're already seeing some movement in the biocrude space in particular, as well as renewable hydrogen. So can't put necessarily firm figures to that, especially as it relates to the second part of your question, which is essentially what are going to be the primary drivers. But I can tell you that we're already seeing those projects emerging.
You have anything to add?
I spoke with one producer who pointed out the hurdles on biocrude and mentioned, again, not being an insider or working at a refinery, but that there are a lot of hurdles, regulatory hurdles as well as permitting hurdles. So when you introduce a new stream into a refinery, you really have to go back to the drawing board and do a lot. So I think we're waiting for longer-term market stability, as we all have. And I would guess that the obligated parties, if they see that, will also start to invest longer term, but are waiting a bit in the side until they see that for sure.
Seeing no other people standing, I have a couple of questions. Ryan, you mentioned that the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program is currently in an over-compliance mode. When do you anticipate that we'll start depleting those credits and start to really see those prices drive higher?
I think it's a great question. The 10% threshold by 2020 really will demand that bank of credits that we have, the 8.2 million metric tons, be included to get to that 10%. However, all of this is contingent really about market stability. I mean, we could see a lot of credits driven from the obligated parties from biocrudes. We could see it from natural gas or EVs. There are great opportunities, I think, with market stability. So the same question would go towards your other question about that 18 to 25% and what will factor into that. So I think over the next couple years, if we can consistently see an increase in the bank, then CARB will feel more comfortable about increasing and going to a higher threshold to 2030. If we see that bank start to get pulled down, then we'll see, I think, them leaning closer to the 18% rather than the 25%. When exactly do we see that bank being influenced? It's hard to say. I think the way the numbers suggest, we haven't seen anything coming down yet, so perhaps 2018 or 19. But crossing my fingers that bank keeps going up, and therefore CARB feels more comfortable about pushing out a higher threshold for later. So that's on all of us to produce and come up with lower and lower carbon fuels. I think one of the other exciting things that I know National Biodiesel Board has been working on is to really delve into the GREET model numbers and help to reduce ILUC numbers further. We've already gone from 60 to 30 on soy biodiesel. If we see further reductions in the next couple years before 2019, perhaps there'll be further opportunities to drive up that bank and really increase the market for everybody. That's the idea, is to not hurt any biodiesel producers, but really expand the market for everyone.
Great. Go ahead.
Thank you. Excellent presentation on California, but also since California influences a whole lot of other states along in the Northwest, how is this going to, like the state of Oregon or the other states, are they basically going to follow some of these same principles, or what are some of the things that might be happening there for whoever?
Louie, you want to take that, or?
Well, I'll just say that as a teaser, please come Thursday morning for our last session, where we will be discussing Oregon at a greater extent. And Oregon has essentially mimicked the California program in many facets. However, it's 5 years delayed. So their 10% goes to 2025 rather than 2020. And of course, it is a smaller market. So what we've seen in Oregon in the first 2 quarters of reporting compliance is about 10 million gallons of biodiesel consumed each quarter for the last 2 quarters. But their overall market, on one hand, it's great because they already have a B5 in place, and this is above and beyond that B5, so we'll see that move higher. Of course, they don't have any ADF in the short term because they're not using CARBOB, so they could really embrace B20 sooner and are and have. So we have a great new NBB sponsor here, Sequential, so welcome to the fold. We have a new Oregon producer that joined NBB, and they've been a great lead there for Oregon.
Great. Just in closing, thanks again to my panelists, and I want to call out a little bit the California Biodiesel Alliance. The CBA has been very successful in capturing the attention of legislators and regulators as a result of the financial support of our sponsors and the tireless hours put in by our board of directors and our executive director, Celia. She's over there, and I'm going to have you guys go talk to her if you potentially want to be a member or a sponsor of CBA. The National Biodiesel Board, Shelby, if you're in here, we wouldn't be here without all the hard work and dedication and sponsorship. I also want to thank Eco Engineers, a silver sponsor for the last several years, Baker Commodities, Evonik, Act Commodities, and the Jacobson. Thanks for your support. And if you liked what you heard here, please register to attend the California Biodiesel Alliance Conference March 1st in Sacramento. We're going to be talking a lot about all the carbon policies and some of the other things that are going on in California. We have sponsorship opportunities available, and we really would like to have you as a member and answer as many questions as you have in more time at that conference. So with that, thank you very much for attending our panel, and we'll be around for a few minutes to answer any direct questions. Thanks. Oh, wait. Before you leave, I forgot. I have an award. A winner has been randomly selected if you checked in Biodiesel Connect. The winner is Dev Shretha from University of Idaho. Yay. All right, come get your gift card. Thanks, guys.